I have a few Buy Me a Coffee supporters to thank, including Jose España, also Mandy, who listens while taking a break from finishing her grad school work in library science, and Natalie Zett, who has an amazing podcast about the Eastland disaster called Flower in the River that I highly recommend. If you'd like to support this podcast and help offset production costs, you can do so with a one-time gift of just a few bucks through the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show's notes. And if money is tight, no worries. Just tell a friend about the Chicago History Podcast or leave a review. Any effort is greatly appreciated. And now, it was the biggest funeral Chicago had seen since that of Abraham Lincoln. As the procession traveled down the streets of the city on May 26, 1889, thousands of mourners followed. This event was not for a public official, but merely for a doctor, one with ties to Ireland's fight for independence from England, a doctor whose life ended abruptly and violently. Today we're discussing Chicago's Irish history, the murder of Dr. Patrick Henry Cronin. I'm Tommy Henry, and this is the Chicago History Podcast. As this episode deals with gruesome subject matter, listener discretion is advised. If you're a fan of reading, there is a wonderfully written book about today's story called Blood Runs Green, The Murder That Transfixed Gilded Age Chicago by Gillian O'Brien that I highly recommend, as it goes into much more detail than time allows here. I'll have a link in the show's notes if you're interested in getting a copy. The episode I did about St. Patrick's Day in Chicago a while back traced some of the early history of Irish in Chicago. If you didn't hear that episode, here is a quick refresher. Irish immigrants came to Chicago even before Chicago became incorporated as a city in 1837, with many Irish taking backbreaking work for little pay. One of the more notable work projects utilizing Irish laborers was the Illinois and Michigan Canal, which linked Lake Michigan and the Illinois and Mississippi rivers. Much of the work done to construct the canal between 1836 and 1848 was done by Irish laborers who stayed in transient work camps in less than ideal conditions, moving along the canal as needed. It wasn't until Ireland experienced 5 potato crop failures beginning in 1845, losing nearly 1 million of its people to disease and poverty, and between 1.5 and 2 million more to emigration, that the once meager Irish population in Chicago began to spike. And because Chicago, that influx of Irish into the city was not welcomed with open arms. Signs in windows at businesses looking to hire workers read, "Help wanted, no Irish, need apply." I found hundreds of classified ads in newspapers in and around Chicago, starting in 1861 with the same wording. A few read, "Catholic Irish need not apply," as the Protestants at the time were held in higher regard. According to Ellen Scarrett in the Encyclopedia of Chicago, in the 1850s and 1860s, Chicago Tribune publisher Joseph Medill, who was the son of Ulster Presbyterians, often equated Irish with Catholic in his newspaper's coverage of the city's issues with crime, poverty, politics, and Irish nationalism. Fortunately, Medill's intended slur had the opposite effect. It deepened the connection between ethnic identity, Catholicism, and nationalism. By 1860, Chicago was the 4th largest Irish city in America, and with this growing population of Irish came organizations devoted to Irish causes here and abroad. One of the first Irish organizations in the United States was the Fenian Brotherhood, described as a form of militant Irish American nationalism whose goal was to secure Irish independence from Britain. The Brotherhood arose after the failed 1848 Fenian Rebellion in Ireland amid the poverty-facing famine generation Irish in America. Although the Fenian Brotherhood formed in New York in 1858, it soon found a home among the approximately 20,000 Irish immigrants living in Chicago at the start of the Civil War. The Fenian Brotherhood was largely discredited in the U.S. after bizarre attempts in 1866, 1870, and 1871 to invade Canada to attack British bases. In its place, the Clan na Gael began its rise to prominence. Clan na Gael was formed in New York in 1867 as a secret Irish Republican organization dedicated to freeing Ireland from British control by any means necessary, including force. Clan na Gael soon expanded other cities with large Irish populations, like Chicago. For nearly an entire decade during the 1880s, Chicago was at the forefront of Irish nationalism in the United States. 3 of the major figures in Irish America during that time even lived in the same near North Side neighborhood. Alexander Sullivan, born in Ontario, Canada, to parents from County Cork, was an ambitious lawyer who lived for a time in Detroit, where he became active in the Fenian movement and Republican politics. Sullivan came to Chicago in 1873 and was described as clean-shaven and always nicely dressed in a black suit. Sullivan had numerous professions between the years 1865 and 1895, including as a journalist, a postmaster, a city official, a tax collector, the owner of a shoe store and a newspaper, and others. It was Sullivan's role as the leader of Camp 20, the Chicago division of Clan na Gael, that would bring him into contact with Dr. Patrick Henry Cronin. Patrick Cronin was born in County Cork, Ireland in 1846 and came to the States when he was a baby. After living in New York, Baltimore, and Ontario, Canada, Cronin finished his schooling and returned to the United States. Cronin found his way west to St. Louis, where he took a job as a warehouse porter. After finding a sponsor for his continuing studies, Cronin was finally able to pursue his dream of becoming a physician, enrolling at the Missouri Medical College, from which he graduated, then secured a master's degree and Ph.D. from St. Louis University. Along with his schooling, Cronin was dedicated to Irish causes, becoming a member of several societies, including the Ancient Order of Hibernians and, in late 1876, the Clan na Gael. Cronin had become acquainted with Alexander Sullivan through Clan na Gael, and realizing that in order for him to progress within the clan, he needed to be in the same city as Sullivan. In 1882, Cronin left St. Louis and headed to Chicago, thanks in part to Alexander Sullivan, who helped Cronin secure a position at Cook County Hospital. Now, although it may sound like Dr. Cronin and Alexander Sullivan were well on their way to becoming fast friends, any chance of that quickly dissolved. I'll get to that in a moment. Dr. Cronin soon left Cook County Hospital, setting up a private practice at 2 offices, one in the Chicago Opera House block in the downtown area, and one in the Windsor Theater building on Clark, just north of Division Street. It was at the Windsor Theater building that Cronin also resided with longtime friends Theo and Cordelia Conklin. As most of his patients were Irish, Dr. Cronin quickly became well known in the area's Irish community. With a strong tenor voice, Cronin could be seen singing at Holy Name Cathedral Church, as well as at concerts organized by fellow Irish Americans. The more Cronin became involved with Irish efforts, the more he suspected that Alexander Sullivan was a professional patriot, a person who claimed to be interested in Ireland's freedom, but really was just looking for a cause that would enhance their personal wealth. Cronin claimed to have proof that Sullivan had taken $100,000, roughly $3.4 million today, from the organization. Sullivan said he was merely investing it for the organization, although Cronin thought he did so for his own benefit. Either way, Sullivan invested the full amount in the Chicago Board of Trade, trading mainly in railroad and telegraph shares, and lost all but $5,000 of it. When the National Clan na Gael organization investigated the allegations against Sullivan, they found him not guilty. Of course, being accused of this crime put Sullivan at odds with Dr. Cronin, and soon rumors began to spread that Dr. Cronin was a spy for the British. While Sullivan supporters got behind that rumor, those who knew Dr. Cronin disregarded it. Before long, a plan was quietly hatched to get revenge against the doctor once and for all. In February of 1889, a man calling himself J.B. Simons visited a furniture store and bought a few items, including a carpet, a bed, a lamp, a rocking chair, and a large trunk. The same man rented an apartment on Clark Street near Washington Street, not far from Dr. Cronin's office in the Opera Block, furnishing the apartment with the recently purchased items. A month later, in March of 1889, when the landlord came to pick up the next month's rent, the apartment had been emptied out. Days later, someone claiming to be Frank Williams rented a cottage from the Carlson family in Lakeview, which at the time was not yet part of Chicago. The furniture used at the new apartment was the same items, including the large trunk that had been moved from the flat at Clark and Washington just a few days before. In April of 1889, Patrick O'Sullivan, an ice dealer described as a small and very ordinary-looking Irishman with beetling black eyebrows which run together across his low forehead, approached Dr. Cronin to offer him a job as company physician for O'Sullivan's Ice House in Lakeview, near what is now roughly 3400 North Ashland at Roscoe. The arrangement was simple. For $8 a month, Dr. Cronin would be on call if any of O'Sullivan's employees at the Ice House in Lakeview needed medical attention. O'Sullivan explained that if anyone handed Cronin one of O'Sullivan's cards, that would signify the need for the doctor's services. This was an odd arrangement, as Dr. Cronin's office was not terribly close to the Ice House, and the Ice House only employed 4 people. And it wasn't dangerous work, but still Dr. Cronin agreed to the offer. Dr. Cronin was in his office seeing patients on the evening of Saturday, May 4th, 1889. He planned to attend a meeting that night of the Celto-American Society, which had published a paper the doctor helped edit. As Cronin finished with his last patient of the night, the doorbell to the flat rang. Mrs. Conklin answered the door and was greeted by a pale, out-of-breath man. The man blurted out, "Is Dr. Cronin in?" "Yes," Mrs. Conklin responded, "but he's busy with a patient." The nervous stranger said, "Well, I want to see him. It's a matter of life and death." Dr. Cronin, hearing fragments of the conversation, stepped out to see the man at the doorway. "What is the matter?" Cronin asked. The man leaned in, handing Cronin a card. "Doctor, one of the workmen at O'Sullivan's Ice House at Lakeview has met with an accident and been terribly injured about here." The man gestured toward his abdomen, then continued. "Unless a doctor sees him at once, he will die. O'Sullivan is out of town, but he has spoken so often of you and said that you should be called in case of any accident that I thought I'd better come get you." Dr. Cronin glanced at the card the man handed him. It was indeed for the O'Sullivan Ice Company, the same card O'Sullivan said someone in his employ might hand him if he needed the doctor's services. Although he was due at the event, Cronin's dedication to his profession wouldn't allow him to turn away the man and risk someone's injury getting worse. Cronin grabbed his medical bag, gathering surgical instruments and absorbent cotton for possible surgery. Outside was a white horse and buggy at the ready. As Cronin stepped out onto the street, he was greeted by his friend Frank Scanlon, who planned to accompany Cronin to the meeting. Scanlon asked the doctor, "Are you ready?" Cronin responded, "No, I'm called away on an accident case." The agitated stranger, already sitting in the buggy, called out, "There's no time to lose." Scanlon was startled by the strange man's outburst, as well as the look of fiendish rage in the man's eyes. As the whip in the hands of the strange man came down on the horse, Cronin said to his friend, "I may get downtown in an hour, but don't wait for me. I really don't know how long this case will occupy me." And with that, Dr. Cronin left with the strange man as the buggy headed off. It would be the last time any of Dr. Patrick Henry Cronin's friends saw him alive. The following morning, realizing that Patrick Cronin had not returned, his friends and flatmates, the Conklins, reported him missing. Police were slow to respond. After all, Cronin was a single man in his mid-40s, and no reports of anything suspicious the previous night had been filed. As word of the missing doctor began to spread, 2 patrolmen came forward with a story they thought might be important. At around 2 a.m., the night Cronin disappeared, the patrolmen were standing near the corner of Clark and Diversey when 2 men on a wagon being pulled by a white horse sped past, traveling north. In the back of the wagon was a large trunk. The patrolman told the men to stop, which the men ignored. About 90 minutes later, the officers saw the same wagon heading south, this time without the trunk. Sure, it was late and the men were acting suspiciously, but the patrolman brushed it off. Around 7:30 a.m. Sunday morning, several men were standing on both sides of a ditch near Sulzer Street, now called Montrose Avenue, and Evanston Avenue, now called Broadway. In front of them was a large trunk with its lid open. The interior of the trunk was splattered with blood and cotton that was soaked red. It also contained a lock of short, brown hair. Later that evening, the 2 patrolmen who saw the speeding wagon identified the trunk as the one they saw on that wagon. As concerned as friends were for Cronin, reports started coming in of sightings of the doctor. One woman swore she saw him on a streetcar in Chicago, and the streetcar driver confirmed her story. Another man who knew Cronin claimed to have had a conversation with Cronin on a street in Toronto, and another even reported seeing him in London, surely another sign Cronin was a spy for the British. Newspaper writers excitedly reported every detail about the case of the missing physician, and Chicagoans could not get enough. A handsome Irish doctor disappears after being accused of acting as a spy for the British? One Chicagoan following these stories was Pat Dinnan, described as a weather-beaten man about 45 years old who owned a livery stable at what is now 827 North Clark Street. Dinnan read in the papers about the buggy pulled by a white horse that whisked Dr. Cronin off the night he went missing. Dinnan had such a horse and buggy and remembered that on the night in question, it had been hired by Big Dan Coughlin, a detective with the Chicago Police Department. This was not uncommon, as detectives often hired horses and buggies from Dinnan stables, but something wasn't sitting right. Dinnan decided to head to his local station to report what he knew. At the police station, Dinnan bumped into Detective Coughlin, who pleaded with Dinnan not to tell his supervisors about the horse and buggy. Coughlin felt that because he and Cronin were enemies, due to being on opposite sides of the Clondegale dust-up, Coughlin's supervisors might suspect he had some involvement. Dinnan agreed and left the station, but later changed his mind and reported what he knew. There were certainly many strange occurrences surrounding Dr. Patrick Cronin's disappearance, but with little to go on that showed anything untoward had transpired, police suspended their investigation on May 14th, just 9 days after he was reported missing. On Wednesday, May 22nd, 18 days after Dr. Patrick Cronin was last seen, 3 workmen were inspecting a catch basin in Lakeview on Evanston Avenue, now Broadway, near North 59th Street, now called Foster Avenue. As they approached the area on the southeast corner of the intersection, they were each struck by the foul scent emanating from the basin. As these catch basins were part of the sewage system, they were prone to smells, but this was something more. Looking through the iron bars of the grate covering the catch basin, they saw something large blocking the sewer. One man suggested it might be a dog, but it soon became clear it was something much worse. One of the men left to go to the Lakeview police station to report what they saw. Soon, Police Captain E.H. Wing arrived with several of his officers. Prying open the cover to the catch basin, the officers and public works employees pulled out the naked corpse of a man that had been badly beaten and had signs of being submerged in water for some time. As they laid the body down on the ground in front of them, it became clear this wasn't just any dead body. It was the body of Dr. Patrick Henry Cronin. Cronin's friend, Theo Conklin, was brought in and tearfully identified his flatmate's body, as did Cronin's dentist, who recognized his own dental work that had been performed on the doctor. As the news of the discovery of Cronin's body began to spread, crowds surrounded the police station, with many of the ghouls taking turns trying to look into the small window for a view of Cronin's body in the basement morgue. One reporter for the Chicago Tribune, who knew Dr. Cronin and was another who identified the body, shared the following in the newspaper. The action of the dripping water in the sewer had loosened the hair of the scalp, face, chest, and shins. The mustache had fallen off and lay in a tangled mess on the right cheek. The lips, swollen and bloated, were stretched wide, and at the corners of the mouth showed traces of agony. The two front teeth, a prominent feature of the doctor, showed ghastly beneath the half-parted lips. The slight goatee remained. The slight baldness at the front of the head was doubly visible beneath the tangled mass of wet hair. At the corner of the left eye was a gash 2 inches long. Over the top of the skull, 2 lengthy wounds on the right temple, and another deep cut. An autopsy was performed that showed considerable bruising on Cronin's lower limbs, but no defensive wounds. Of the 6 significant head injuries, at least 3 would have proved fatal, including one that was most likely inflicted by an attacker using an ice pick. The day after Cronin's body was discovered, police received a tip about a cottage that had been rented near what is now Ashland and Roscoe, the Carlson Cottage, which was only a few doors down from O'Sullivan's ice house. Upon entering the empty cottage, police noticed bloodstains on the walls and floor that had been hastily painted over in a clumsy attempt to cover up what they surmised was a murder. Police questioned Patrick O'Sullivan, the Iceman, who claimed to know nothing about the death of Dr. Cronin or about the man who lured Cronin away from his home the night he went missing. The police, however, weren't buying it. On the afternoon of Saturday, May 25th, 1889, nearly 12,000 people filled the 1st Cavalry Armory on Jackson between Michigan and Wabash. Many were there to pay their respects, while others were caught up in one of the biggest news stories Chicago had ever seen. According to one report, the crowd was made up of a variety of ages and classes, from the child scarcely able to toddle to the aged man walking with faltering, uncertain steps. Parents took their children, and children their grandparents. The day laborer walked beside the well-dressed professional man. Due to the condition of Cronin's body, the coffin remained closed to public viewing. Cronin's casket was French walnut, decorated with gold and silver, and stood on a platform. Numerous plants and flowers, white hyacinths, ferns, daisies, and pink roses, turned the normally militaristic interior of the armory into a more visually appealing sight for one of this man's final events. Also on that day, Chicago police detective Dan Coughlin was arrested in connection with the murder of Dr. Cronin. The following day, Cronin's casket was loaded into a hearse pulled by 4 black horses. Family and friends, occupying several carriages, kept pace behind. Following the hearse and family carriages was a procession of 7,000 mourners, led by Reed's drum corps. According to the Chicago Tribune, 40,000 onlookers lined the path, and it took an hour and a half for the procession to pass a given point. The hearse arrived at Holy Name Cathedral, where a crowd of 4,000 occupied every seat and filled the aisles, while many more waited outside. Several priests were on hand to concelebrate the Requiem Mass. One of them, Father Peter J. Muldoon, was a friend of Cronin and shared a story highlighting the dead doctor's devotion to others. He was told that a fellow man was sick, and instantly, without hesitation, with his heart full of charity, and in his hands the very instruments to bring relief and mercy to a fellow being, he goes forth with goodwill to his fellow man, and meets what? An atrocious death? At the end of the funeral mass, the procession headed a Union Depot, where 20,000 people were gathered outside the station. 2,500 more waited inside. 3 trains had been hired to take 2,500 mourners to Calvary Cemetery in Evanston, roughly 10 miles to the north, for the internment. Hundreds more made their way north in horse-drawn carriages. More than 3,000 mourners stood in the rain while the casket containing the remains of Dr. Patrick Henry Cronin was lowered into the grave. We'll be right back.
Are you a Caribbean American? Are you looking for a podcast that truly speaks to your culture and identity? Look no further than Carry On Friends, the ultimate destination for all things Caribbean American, hosted by me, Carrie Ann. Dive deep into topics such as culture, heritage, and everyday life through the unique lens of the Caribbean American experience. You'll walk away feeling more connected to your roots. Follow and listen on Apple Podcasts so you'll never miss an episode of Carry On Friends, the Caribbean American experience. Your Caribbean American community awaits.
As the police continued their investigation, more arrests were made in the murder of Dr. Cronin. Local Clan na Gael leader Alexander Sullivan was arrested, but while Sullivan was well known to have had animosity toward Cronin, authorities did not have evidence showing Sullivan participated directly in Cronin's death, and Sullivan was released. Frank Williams, the man who rented the Carlson cottage where the murder was thought to take place, was identified as Martin Burke, a laborer for the local Clan na Gael who had fled to Winnipeg, Canada. He was extradited back to Chicago to stand trial. Also arrested were John Coons, a friend of Detective Dan Coughlin, who was identified as the driver of the wagon. John Beggs, a lawyer and senior member of Alexander Sullivan's Clan na Gael Camp 20, who was thought to have helped organize the killing. All told, 9 people were named as being connected to the murder, but many had left the U.S. before capture. 5 men would stand trial in the murder of Dr. Patrick Henry Cronin. In what would become the longest-running trial in American history up until that time, it took weeks to find 12 men who did not already have an opinion about the much-publicized murder. In all, 1,115 men were interviewed before a jury was seated. At trial, the prosecution described what happened the night Dr. Cronin went to the Carlson cottage, thinking he was there to offer aid to an injured worker. While that area now is near the Brown Line L between the Southport and Paulina stops, with beautiful houses and well-manicured lawns and apartment buildings, back then it was farmland. Isolated from prying eyes, it was an ideal spot for murder. As Dr. Cronin stepped into the room, he was struck hard in the back of the head from behind and fell to his knees. Blood began to gush from his wound, and he tried to regain his footing to fight back. Repeated blows from more than one attacker eventually caused Cronin to lose consciousness. His body was then stuffed into the large trunk, which was then placed on the back of the wagon pulled by the white horse. As to why Dr. Cronin was naked when his body was found, some speculated that his murderers had planned to take his clothes, papers, and other personal effects and have them sent to London, where co-conspirators would find a look-alike body, plant all of Cronin's effects on the body overseas, and then dump the deceased in the River Thames, giving support to the idea that Cronin was indeed a British spy. Author Gillian O'Brien's take on whether Cronin was a spy is one with which I agree. He wasn't. If Cronin was indeed a spy, he'd have ingratiated himself into the secret and not-so-secret Irish societies of Chicago and went along with their shenanigans, not create waves, as he did. Although the men on trial were not wealthy, somehow they had an expensive legal team. Gillian O'Brien, author of Blood Runs Green, is confident that the men's defense was funded by Alexander Sullivan. The trial dragged on for 3.5 months, with closing arguments lasting 14 days, ending just before Christmas. The jury deliberated for 72 hours before returning a mixed verdict. John H. Beggs, the Camp 20 lawyer and alleged arranger of the murder, was found not guilty. John Coons, the driver of the wagon, was found guilty of manslaughter. Disgraced Detective Daniel Coughlin, Iceman Patrick O'Sullivan, and Martin Burke, who had rented the Carlson cottage where Cronin was killed, were all convicted of first-degree murder. Coons appealed his verdict and was acquitted during his second trial. Coughlin was granted a second trial on the grounds that 2 of the original jurors were prejudiced against him, which resulted in his acquittal. Before the end of that year, the book The Clan na Gael and the Murder of Dr. Cronin, written by John T. McInnes, was published, purporting to be a, quote, complete and authentic narrative of the rise and development of the Irish Revolutionary Movement and an impartial account of the crime at the Carlson cottage. In the preface, it is explained that the book has been prepared so that no wrong shall be done the men who are on trial for their lives, and no improper accusation brought against the Irish revolutionary organizations. It was at least one of 2 books written about the crime, the other being The Crime of the Century or The Assassination of Dr. Patrick Henry Cronin by Henry M. Hunt. At least 7 books about the case were released within 2 years of Cronin's murder. After Detective Dan Coughlin's release from prison following his acquittal, he opened a saloon in Chicago, but he did not stay in business for long. He fell afoul of authorities in a bribery case, and when indictments were handed down against him, he fled to Honduras, where it is thought he died. The Iceman Patrick O'Sullivan and Martin Burke both died of tuberculosis in Joliet Prison in 1892. Alexander Sullivan spent the next few years around Chicago as a lawyer, but within the Irish community had lost much of his standing. Sullivan died of a blood infection in 1913. If you visit Calvary Cemetery in Evanston today, all the way on the east side, closest to Lake Michigan, you'll find 2 paths that connect. Nearby, you'll see a 1 by 2 foot granite plaque, awkwardly wedged between 2 larger stones, with an inscription that reads, Dr. P. H. Cronin, 1846 to 1899. Rest in peace. Today's episode about the murder of Dr. Patrick Cronin was researched, written, narrated, and edited by me, Tommy Henry. There is a lot to this story I was unable to include due to time constraints, so if you're at all intrigued and want to learn more, there's a link to Gillian O'Brien's book, Blood Runs Green, in the show's notes, or see if your local library has a copy. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave a 5-star rating, or even better, a written review, especially if you listen on Apple Podcasts, as it will help the podcast grow and reach new fans. Your review may be featured on a future episode or on social media. The Chicago History Podcast logo and art used on these social media pages was created by John K. Schneider. Thanks, pal. If you need creative work done, email him at angeleyesartjks@gmail.com. I'll be back soon with another chapter in Chicago's history. Until then, get out and explore when possible. Learn more about whatever city you live in, and stay safe.